Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And if you want to stay on top of all things clown decade, do subscribe to the channel and of course become a member. And today I've decided to take a look at Sophie Corcoran's Reform article over on Conservative Home. For those of you who need a quick rundown of what Conservative Home is, it's effectively Jacob Rees-Mogg's fans' website. They used to run a podcast called The Mogcast before he was on GB News, and effectively it's for the pretty firm centre-right of the party, the types who are frankly most likely to go over to Reform. So here's what Sophie Corcoran had to say. So, Reform is failing in the same way the Tories did, which is a take. One I'm really going to need clarifying. So when I left the Conservative Party, it wasn't on a whim. Like many others, I was disillusioned. The Tories had drifted too far from their values they once upheld, which include personal responsibility, economic discipline, and competence. I don't think competence is necessarily a value, but yes, they were competent. Reform UK seemed to offer something better, a principled alternative rooted in common sense conservatism, but after months of campaigning for the party, including spending my birthday canvassing in a by-election, I've come to a difficult conclusion. Reform UK isn't what it appears to be from the outside. I mean, when their tagline at the moment is family, community, country, it does seem pretty conservative, I have to say. One of my biggest concerns is the gulf between what Reform UK promises and what it actually delivers. Okay. On 24 April, its leader Nigel Farage stood at a press conference in Dover and claimed that the party's detailed deportation policy would be released within 3 to 4 weeks. And 2 days later, Zahir Yusuf posts online, obviously, that he'd be promising it within the next month. The next month being May, and obviously it's now June, and that policy is nowhere to be seen. Yeah, did something happen in May, at the start of May, that probably would have got in the way of focusing on policy? You know, we're talking about a party that was not expected to win the Runcorn by-election, and did. Was expected to take control of maybe a couple of councils, maybe 3 if they're lucky, took control of 10, and one which, obviously, with the mayor elections, they were expecting pretty much Dame Andrea Jenkins, and that's it, but no, they also got Luke Campbell as well, and the others weren't far behind. They vastly overperformed, and so it's not particularly a shock that abstract policy that was going to be released after that to keep momentum up wasn't really needed because momentum was already absolutely huge. Do I want to see this policy as well? Yeah, absolutely. Do I care much more about them delivering for these councils? Absolutely. And I mean, on that front, what's been disappointing? Well, there's nothing here. It's just an abstract, oh, we promised one thing, circumstances massively change, therefore the deadline changes. I mean, this is normal. I've said it for some time now, but honestly, the absolute ridiculous bar that people are expecting for Reform is absolutely crazy. I can understand it to an extent, because a lot of people do feel like this is the last chance. But in my mind, that means, well, lower the bar a bit. Don't expect perfection. Otherwise, you won't get anything close to what you want anyway. Ultimately, what we have at the moment is a Tory party whose actual policy is basically to review everything, with obviously Robert Jenrick being the main frontrunner for saying base things, and he's been saying base things for, maybe a year now. And then you compare it to someone like Farage, who has been saying base things for 30 years. Who am I going to trust to be more interested in these convictions? Obviously the man who's been talking about the same thing for 30 years. I was arguing with people this morning because of obviously that New Statesman thing where Farage was saying, well, Jenrick's probably going to be to the right of me come the election. The reason he says that is because Jenrick's trying to make a knot of noise. In other words, he's a panicking charlatan. He then obviously also said public opinion's probably to the right on me on immigration, and people for ages were saying, oh, Farage is, this is actually the case, Farage is too far left on immigration, things like that. He has to realise this, and now he's realised it. Apparently it's a bad thing. Oh, he said that he's left on immigration. Yeah, the implication of that is they're going to be moving right. Because their ultimate goal is to try and capture the centre ground. And saying, oh, we're actually possibly to the left on this issue, believe it or not, indicates they're going to move right. But anyway, I'd save all of the commentary on their immigration policy until we've actually seen immigration policy, which obviously is being delayed because all of a sudden you didn't just need Doge for 2 or 3 councils, you needed it for 10. And the things they are finding is ridiculous. I mean, honestly, I found out today that West Nottinghamshire Council, which was Tory-led, decided that they needed net zero by 2030, with other areas needing it by 2045, literally ahead of the government's own goal. This was a Tory council, by the way, not a Green one, so let's be real here. Top to bottom, the Tory party is full of communists. The membership is maybe the most based part, but most of the base people have already left either to join Reform or be politically homeless. Anyway, this is not an isolated case. In February, Farage claimed that Reform would initiate a private prosecution against Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds for allegedly misrepresenting his legal credentials. Nothing has come of it. The same goes for the promised independent inquiry into grooming gangs. To be fair, on the first one, I've not heard anything about that, so fair enough. The second one, they explained why they didn't do their own independent inquiry into the grooming gangs. It's because it would cost way too much for very little in regard of what can come back, so they moved over to planning judicial reviews. And the government have now got the National Grooming Inquiry underway anyway, which, okay, yeah, it's going to be somewhat bastardised. So given the way they head forward, it's probably going to have ways to put pressure on that as well. Another pledge that quietly disappeared. It didn't quietly disappear, they explained it. For a party that built its reputation on criticising the Tories for failing to deliver, Reform is rapidly falling into the same pattern, bold announcements for headlines with little follow-through. Well, I mean, I'm not being funny, but Doge seems to be going somewhat well. The Kent County Council leader, who, obviously that's a Reform-controlled one, she's in the news pretty much once a week talking about the things they find through the Doge team, including massive price for taxis, obviously. Plenty of this, unfortunately, is compelled spending by the government on things like send children, which obviously that's a big headline now and something that has to be reformed. Again, being brought forward by Kent County Council along with the others. There's a reason they're focusing mostly on Kent, and it's because that seems to be the council where most of the problems are, because obviously they take the brunt of the illegal migration. And so that's also why Zia's constantly going on about how taxpayer money's been used to spend on TV licenses and days at trampoline parks for illegals. You know, these things don't happen overnight. Put these problems and collate them all together in massive reports and find ways to deal with them. That takes months of work. But anyway, then there's this baffling pledge to scrap the two-child benefit cap, which is a policy that undermines the very principles Reform was supposed to stand for. Okay? For those unfamiliar, including the Reform leadership themselves, alright, Catty, the cap limits additional welfare payments to families with more than 2 children on universal credit. Reform argues that the move would boost the birth rate, but in reality it only allows existing benefit claimants to access more money, does nothing to help working families trying to get by without state support. I mean, if we actually take a look at what was said about the policy by Reform, that is why we believe lifting the two-child benefit cap is the right thing to do, not because we support benefits culture, but because we believe for lower paid workers, this actually makes having children just a little bit easier for them. Which, at least on the stated preference front, is true. A lot of people say they can't afford kids, so obviously make it easier to afford them. A big thing will actually be childcare costs coming down, but, well, as they say, this isn't a silver bullet, but it does help them. The policy was aimed at British families and not people that had moved from overseas and chosen to have children in the UK. The decision to back lifting the two-child cap comes after Labour refused to lift the cap last year, even removing the whip from a number of its own MPs for voting against the whip and supporting lifting the cap in Parliament. And this week, Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson hinted the government may consider lifting the cap, telling the BBC that government's child poverty task force was looking at the cap and nothing is off the table. And then obviously Farage went into his transferable tax allowance, which effectively means that there will be more of an allowance for married couples to send money to each other tax-free. Obviously that's, I believe, applied to the income tax. So effectively, if, say, your wife doesn't work, you can have £40,000 tax-free of your income if you are the sole provider of that family, which largely makes sense. Any mention on the transferable tax allowance for married couples? Absolutely nothing. I'm just going to focus on the two-child benefit cap and ignore all the caveats around it too. This is how an awful lot of the right wing end up criticising Farage and Reform, and I'm getting really tired of it. There seems to be endless charitability for people like Rupert Lowe, Robert Jenrick, Ben Habib, all these sorts of people. These people who largely are not going to actually end up anywhere close to power. And frankly, what I've seen over the past few months from Farage and Reform have been them effectively getting ready for government and making it clear what their priorities are. The benefit system is not going to be completely cut and be a Randian's dream. Am I upset about that? A little, but I also understand that that is my crazy ideal world that I'm never going to get. They've made it clear, though, that the only people who will be able to get British benefits are those who are British nationals. Now, okay, there's an issue in that the British nationals have been handed out like sweets to people who absolutely should not have it. I do completely understand that. I would say wait for immigration policy, and if that's touched upon, I would say get a bit white-pilled about it. But for now, we don't particularly know. What we do know is that they want to bring legal immigration down to at least net zero, and they've even hinted in the past that it's going to go further than that, and obviously deport all illegals and foreign criminals, both of which are highly popular, both of which if they can't do, because of the civil service or whatever, that's going to mean more on the civil service, which if nothing else is worth getting this reform government in. Actually, another thing before I move on that was completely missed by Corcoran too is that it is specifically only going to be applying to not only British families, but British families that are working. Specifically, they were saying lower paid workers, and they made it clear that it was for British nationals only. Again, you know, the details of that may have some problems with people who may be getting it who shouldn't have British nationality. Fine, we can talk about that, but can we at least be honest and be specific with these criticisms rather than saying, oh, they're just Labour in another skin suit, because that's clearly not the case. I think the maths has been done on foreign nationals who claim PIP, and if you actually took that off them, you'd save £45 billion or something like that. I don't think it was just PIP, I think it was benefits in general, which is pretty much already the defence budget as it is now. And yet here we are with a country that is going to do nothing about that, unless reform gets in, and then there's a chance. Because I don't trust the Tories to do that, and I don't trust Labour to do that. Will Reform do it? Well, they are certainly the most trustworthy. She then goes into some of the numbers on demographics, with 14% of white Brits having 3 or more children compared to, obviously, the large amount of Pakistanis and the large amount of Bangladeshis. Scrapping the cap would benefit these lots. That's only true if, one, they are in full-time work, which, come on, let's be real, how many of them are going to be in legal work anyway. And the second one, obviously, is that they need to be British nationals, which sure will be true for a number of them. That specific criticism would be working a lot better rather than if you just ignored all the caveats that come with it. Scrapping the cap would disproportionately benefit particular demographics, only if they're British citizens, which most of them won't be, while placing a larger burden on the very taxpayers struggling to support their own families. Again, this isn't true if it's all paid for by the complete waste that we are seeing in government. Again, you take benefits off the foreign born, you get 45 billion. That would more than pay for this, obviously. Reform's leadership rightly complains about the £1 billion we spend each month on benefits to foreign nationals, but how does it make sense to push policies that would further inflate that figure? Because you didn't read it, and you didn't bother to understand it, like most people don't. Most people on the online right, and I'm obviously including Sophie Corcoran in this, they just don't do research or care to be remotely careful about their commentary and what they're saying. They don't do the research, they don't look at what's being said, they don't understand what the policy being proposed actually is. They make these vapid assumptions and make absolutely pointless arguments and articles that I then go through to pick apart. I've said it for quite some time, especially about Connor Tomlinson, but these people are basically just turning into right-wing Guardian journos. The Guardian don't even touch upon these points much anymore. The Guardian's mostly about foreign affairs these days, because they've basically lost the argument here. I'd say probably the worst thing you could do as the right now is then effectively become the right-wing Guardian. I don't think that's going to end up particularly well, because the Guardian has 2 issues. One, they're left-wing, and 2, they lie all the time, don't do research, and misrepresent what's being said by people they don't like. The exact same thing's happening here, it's just it's coming from a right-wing perspective, which is an improvement, sure. I'm just asking people to get the details right, and then your analysis will actually be improved. This proposal flies in the face of personal responsibility and fiscal fairness. It's a deeply regressive move, more befitting the Corbynite left than any serious political party. The Corbynite left would not reduce it to just British citizens who are working. That would never happen on the Corbynite left. And I'm not being funny, but if we're talking about birth rates here, obviously helping out British nationals who are working are the best families to help out with that. That's obviously going to be quite appealing to an awful lot of people who are on board with reform. But you didn't read it, and so you wrote this instead. Anyway, what troubles me the most is the culture within reform itself. From the outside, the party presents itself as bold, pro-freedom and insurgent. Okay. The right-wing media gives it a remarkably easy ride. That isn't true. rarely holding its leadership to account. I am not having that by any stretch of the imagination. They're on GB News half the time, Talk TV as well. They're asked about all these things. Julia Hartley-Brewer's pushed back on the two-child benefit cap as well. They certainly get an easier ride than they do from the left-wing media, obviously, but it doesn't mean that they're given an easy ride. I don't buy that. From the inside, it feels paranoid, overly centralised and hostile to dissent. There's a top-down culture of control where speaking up gets you punished. Gotta be honest with you, from my experience, I've not particularly seen that. I have seen complaints within meetings. No one's been kicked out. I voiced my concerns about the two-child benefit policy. I was publicly insulted by Isabel Oakeshott, partner of Deputy Leader Tice. She called me a moron and dismissed my opinion because I'd previously been a Conservative. Well, you know. The other issue with Sophie Corcoran is that absolutely everyone has noticed that effectively she joined Reform, canvassed for them for a week or two, and then basically joined and started supporting absolutely every other outlet that was having a go at Reform. Robert Jenrick, not too much though. Gone over to Habib's lot, supported Rupert Lowe as well. You know, she's part of GB PAC as the youth organiser. That ended up just being a massive group of people who, I mean, I've been in their spaces. Largely whenever they're giving a summary of whatever their mission is, it usually starts with, "We don't trust Farage." And obviously Sophie's in there, not defending it or anything, because largely it's pretty obvious to everyone that she agrees with that. But, well, anyway, I'm still taking this criticism and talking about it fairly. It's rich given how many Reform members, including senior leadership, have themselves been members of multiple parties. I mean, yeah, that's not particularly a unfair response. I've never been that impressed with Isabel Oakeshott when it comes to her social media and media presence. The much more apt response would be, you keep joining all these anti-Reform groups. Obviously, you're not going to be fair when it comes to your complaints about Reform. The party isn't bound tightly by ideology or shared values, but by a need to worship the leadership and Farage as they are God. At least you put a capital G in there. Which I think is a misunderstanding of what's going on here. The reason Nigel Farage is so defended by myself and others is because, simply put, there is no other person that can do what he is doing. There is no one else who is capable of the insurgency. Farage is a 30-year project and has a really good track record of effectively getting what he wants. Brexit vote, he ended up getting it. He ended up helping win the Brexit vote. Obviously Brexit wasn't going through as we'd like, so he helps out with the Brexit party, wins the EU election then makes the bold decision to step down and get Boris Johnson in government. Obviously, that's also to stop the Corbyn government. And we thought we were getting what we want. I remember making a video in 2019 effectively saying, this is it now, lads. Boris Johnson, the big blue wave, is going to come along and save everything. And then, you know, a year later, COVID happens. And then every video after that is basically me saying, I don't think the Tories have got it in them anymore, fellas. And I'm not being funny, but everyone who has come out to say Farage can't work with people, etc., etc., none of these people are working together. They're all out making their own projects, whether that's political parties with Ben Habib, political movements with Rupert Lowe. And while they largely have policies that I do largely agree with, at the end of the day, you can have that all you want. If you can't get into power, all of that's a waste of time. And this is why Farage gets such a wide berth from me. Because frankly, I cannot see how anyone else would get into power and deliver remotely what I want. Reform getting in and just delivering what they are already promising is leaps and bounds better than anything we've had for the past 30 years. Having a shot in the dark with, frankly, some of these largely unknowns like Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib, where's that going to get you? Don't really know. Probably not into Downing Street, though. There is a clear pattern emerging. Rupert Lowe, a respected figure within the party, was pushed aside for daring to challenge the leadership. Yeah, that's stupid. Don't do that. Anyone challenging the leadership is obviously going to suffer consequences. What are you talking about? This happens in literally every party. You know, a bunch of Labour MPs got the whip removed after they challenged the leadership. You know, Zora Sultana being the big one. This is obvious. Local branch chairs have been removed for minor disagreements or simply for asking too many questions. I need details on that because largely the type of people who left were people who effectively trusted Ben Habib more than Farage, which, you know, on your own is absolutely fine. But something that's never really talked about there is that basically all these people were interim leaders and effectively there were votes coming up in like the months later when obviously Ben Habib left and the Rupert Lowe thing happened, then they all effectively ditched it because, well, they were risking their interim position, obviously, with the elections that were coming up. Members operate in a climate of fear, not because they've broken rules, but because they've expressed the wrong opinion. Again, I've been to plenty of meetings. I've been out leafleting plenty of times. There isn't anything like this from what I can see. You know, pretty much every meeting I've been in, there have been questions about policy that haven't been written and complaints saying, can you hurry up with that then? No one's been kicked out and no one feels at risk of being kicked out, so I don't know where this is coming from. This is true of councillors I know too. I don't know any of them that live in a climate of fear like this. Sophie doesn't realise that she is quite unique in her position because while she is still allegedly a member of the party, she has been pretty much doing nothing for months but criticise it, and basically everyone's noticed. So that's probably why she says she's in a climate of fear, because she is effectively acting as an enemy within, whether she means to or not. The same thing happened in the Tories, by the way. She left the Tories, sure, but a lot of the Tories absolutely despised her because she was effectively a fifth column within the Tory party, because she's not a very clever political actor. There's a performative commitment to free speech, but behind the scenes, criticism is met with hostility. Again, from the hundreds of Reform members that I have met, and from the Reform councillors I know, this is not the general vibe that they have or that I've been getting from it either, so I don't know what she means here, aside from the fact that everyone can tell she's just a fifth columnist within Reform. I spent years at one of the most left-leaning universities in the country debating students committed to cancel culture, but even in those spaces I felt freer to speak my mind than I have within Reform UK. Alright. There's a damning indictment for a party that claims to champion free expression. I'm sorry, have any of these people tried to get you to lose your job? Have they tried to get you in jail, anything like that? Or have they just said, why are you bothering to be part of Reform if all you're going to do is be dishonest about them all the time? Is that what's happened instead? Because honestly, when I see people complain about Sophie, that's pretty much all it comes down to. Like, why did you even bother joining Reform if all you're going to do is whinge about them? What has become painfully clear is the leadership's contempt for its own members. Again, I don't know many members that feel this way. I know there's a lot of people on Twitter who say things like that, but at the end of the day, Twitter's its own bubble. There's a little trust and little consultation, with a clear disdain for grassroots. Again, I don't even believe that's true. The branch I was in, as soon as they started saying we're having a bit of trouble with donations, the guy who was the campaign manager for Wales basically just, a couple of texts, and then all of a sudden there ends up being 500 quid extra in the account to help with campaigning and things like that. There's no disdain for the grassroots from what I can say. In fact, head office is perfectly happy to help branches where they can and where they will. This was obvious during the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough mayoral campaign, where the party sent out letters urging Peterborough residents to vote for their local Reform Cambridgeshire County Council candidate, forgetting that Peterborough is a unitary authority and didn't even have local elections. If the leadership had taken time to consult local members, the embarrassment could have been avoided, but they didn't, because the decisions are made up top with no respect for those on the ground. I mean, okay, yeah, that's a big mistake, sure. But at the end of the day, minor embarrassment. I can understand why when you have Cambridge and Peterborough mayoral campaigns, top office say, yes, send all these letters out to everyone within these constituencies and wards to say vote for your councillor. And there isn't a councillor, obviously. But from what I know from my local branch and the team that talk to head office, there are talks that pretty much happen weekly. And as I say, they tend to be quite accommodating. And the thing is, I'm probably in one of the least ready branches in the country. I say that because we've had no elections yet. A couple of by-elections, sure, but obviously Wales is ramping up over the next year, because obviously the next big one are the Senate and the Scottish parliamentary elections that are coming next year. So these things are ramping up. And as I say, 500 quid thrown over to help with a couple of by-elections. This is not my experience, is what I'm saying. It's also not the experience I'm hearing from other councillors. And to be honest with you, if your main, they don't help out with the locals, is head office screwed up and thought there were council elections in Peterborough because they got confused with Cambridgeshire and Peterborough mayoral campaigns, yeah, believe it or not, I'm not fully bothered about that. And as I say elsewhere, Sophie Corcoran is not exactly hiding her intentions when it comes to joining up with a lot of people who spent the last year having a go at Reform, like Ben Habib. Anyway, she says she left the Tory party because she believes they abandoned their principles, failed to deliver promises, and started to get disinterested in the membership. And she thinks Reform are going the same way, which again is simply not my experience. The internal culture of Reform is defined by fear of dissent, a lack of transparency, and a leadership more interested in press than principle. Again, the only time I really see people getting annoyed within Reform meetings are when there's not much detail on certain policy, but they do like the overall direction of travel, which is obviously deport illegals, etc., etc. I believe in loyalty, but to principles, not personalities, and certainly not to parties that betray the ideals they claim to uphold. When did Reform ever say they were going to get rid of all benefits? Honestly, if we're serious about building a better political alternative, then we have to be honest about where Reform UK is falling short. Sometimes doing the right thing means standing apart, even when it comes at personal cost. Sophie Corcoran effectively was supporting Reform for maybe a week or two. People, you don't have to keep a close eye on it to realise that joining all these other parties that are just full of people who do nothing on Twitter but complain about Reform, Farage, Zero, whatever, is probably not a person who was fully involved in the party to begin with. I'm not saying she's necessarily lying about any of this, but what I am saying is that she's clearly misunderstood policy and didn't bother to read it, which most people do, so I'm not going to specifically have a go at her for that. But then if your main example of the central office don't care about us is there was a slight mistake when it came to sending out letters to people who were part of a mayoral election but not part of a council election. Do you not think you're putting an unreasonably high bar for mistakes that Reform are going to make here? There's nobody on the planet that thinks Reform by any means are perfect, but there are an awful lot of people who will always push the bar up for Reform for their level of what they will accept. And as I keep saying, that there's an eternal loser syndrome going about right now in the right. An awful lot of people, June Slater said this, but there's basically an awful lot of people who effectively make their living out of political drama. And the fact of the matter is that if the political drama all of a sudden moves to us effectively winning with the odd hiccup, they're not really going to be able to make a living. And this is why I think there's an eternal loser syndrome. There's an awful lot of people who will always forever raise the bar and will never be happy with the state of politics in this country, because if we end up getting what we want, what do they have to talk about? It's going to be a big career change for an awful lot of them, and I think for an awful lot of them, they are frankly not talented enough to talk about anything else, because frankly, politics is quite easy to talk about. There's plenty of people who do absolutely zero research into all this, have some background knowledge of historical touchstones that they can reference. There's very few people who can delve into politics like someone like Dominic Cummings can. And Dominic Cummings is another, kind of cult of personality who does get the odd thing wrong. But I quite like him. And I quite like him because he can actually change his mind on things, as is quite clear. He's changed his mind on Reform, he's changed his mind on Farage. Clearly, from his point of view, the best way forward is through Reform and Farage. Not necessarily because of what they are now, but because of what they can become. Learning from mistakes, getting on talent on board, things like that. It's quite clear that this is pretty much the only way forward. Tories are way too tainted. Even Robert Jenrick, I don't think, can save them. Nobody's going to believe that the Tory party that let in 5 million people over the last 4 years is serious about actually doing anything about that, especially when most of them are standing by the record regardless because they don't want to say they made a mistake. Which, to be fair to Sophie, she's not defending the Tories by any stretch of the imagination, which is fine, which is why I have more time for than a lot of other people. But at the end of the day, Sophie's just the type of person that wants a job in politics somewhere, and I think she realised quite quickly that she's not going to get it in Reform, because she acted like an open fifth columnist within Reform, and so she's found a job instead in GB Pack, which for some reason as well Rupert Lowe didn't join, but that's a completely different story. But anyway, I think I've gone through this article enough. I didn't think this would take half an hour. This was supposed to be quite a quick and easy one, but there we are. Also, I suggest doing this in your own time, but the comments of this are basically all dunking on Sophie, because effectively people are taking it as she's saying, well, what's the alternative, really? Trusting cleverly, trusting the other people in the Tory party that are still defending their record? I don't think so. And obviously people making the obvious comparison of, sorry, you are having a go at Reform saying it's making the same mistakes as the Tory party, despite the fact that Reform's record is not 14 years long and of absolutely everything we did not want. Again, the only thing that the Tories could defend over the last 14 years was gay marriage. And now they've barely been in councils for 2 months and already it's, oh, well, they're just as bad as Tories then. Like, be real. Come on. Obviously, the main thing from here is whether they learn from their mistakes or not. But honestly, if the mistakes are this small, I think they can repeat these mistakes and not be in too bad a shape. Anyway, with that, that's where I'll leave it. So if you enjoy what I do, do subscribe, become a member, like the video, and obviously comment what you think as well. You can also leave super chats, super thanks on any video or stream that I do. Speaking of streams, Laughing at the Guardian is on Friday this week, so do come along to that. Tosh Talks next week, along with a Hollow Knight run through as well. That will be the gaming stream for next week. Videos out as and when I can make them. With that, that's everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.